we took a decision this morning to go ahead, and I'm as disappointed as the rest of you that David can't be here. But we thought, given that we have great kind of proposers and seconders and 12 people who want to be discussants, and people have travelled, not least Lee Chen, who's travelled from Norway for this particular event, it was better to go ahead and press on. So I shall do my best. Okay, I hope most of you have read the paper or had the opportunity to do so. There's also a single sheet that some of you will have with a list of the 15 statistical challenges that David raises in his paper, which might be useful as a kind of reference. Okay, so what we're talking about: administrative data generated in the course of some operation, then retained in a database. Mostly a necessary part of that operation, quantities of goods, things like travel through London's transport network. And this gives the metaphor that David uses, that the information is used to drive the system, and therefore the data we're talking about is the exhaust from the system, what's left over, and is valuable to us for our own analysis. Occasionally, as well as running the system, we have extra data which is collected deliberately, perhaps in the medical world from wrist health monitors and so on, monitoring people's activity, heart rate and so on. And David also particularly mentions transaction data concerned with events, things like purchases, credit card payments and so on, typically sequences of events. We'll also see in the paper other terms like operational data, management data, and management information. These are all lumped in with what we're discussing today. And this is not merely public sector. You'll see on the paper that David works for Winton Capital Management. Obviously, financial and commercial data are included here within his broad definition. So what we've got is, we're talking about secondary analysis, data which are repurposed. David also mentions big data in his paper. It's often thought of in terms of, obviously, the size of the data sets, that they are big, and the speed and power of computation required to analyse them. David particularly refers to big data in terms of its automatic data capture, the way that data are recorded through telemetry, automatic measurements, phone call data, wrist health monitors. IoT, I had to look that up. You know what it is though, don't you? Internet of Things, things like our fridges telling us to buy more beer and things, and supermarket scanner data. The motivation to use this data comes from things like the Administrative Data Task Force, and I can see some people here today who are involved with this, that these data are a rich source of untapped information for research and policy in the UK, and that the value of this will appreciate over time, particularly relative to other sources of data. And the Stats Authority, and Penny's going to speak to us afterwards, actively encourages the use of the administrative data and other management sources. When we look at administrative data versus sample data, which I probably feel a bit more comfortable with, have a well understood and developed mathematical theory to get inference from the sample to the population. And David mentions here theories. These are not kind of undisputed, even within our own world of sort of survey estimation. We've got model-based estimation, model-assisted, design-based, but largely working together. We agree on some of it, disagree on others. But as Anders Wahlgren say in their paper, and Anders is here, I think, in their excellent book on register-based statistics, they recognise that there are no terms or principles, no such terms or principles for register and statistical data methodology. And what happens is that ad hoc methods are largely used instead of methods based on a generally accepted theory. And actually, I think what most people do with administrative data is clean it and then add it up. And that is the basis of the inference. So what are the claims made for admin data? David includes 6 here. The admin data are essentially free because they've already been collected by somebody else and are available. That all the data are available. I'm not saying you should agree with all these. That the data are high quality because the administrative process relies on it. That they're up to date. The HMRC has got how much we are going to be paid at the end of this month, if we're paid through PAYE. that the data record what people do, not what people say they do. Here, David asserts that it's possible that the data are closer to a social reality. If you have a wrist monitor counting your steps, that is probably pretty close to the number of steps you actually took that day, and not what you said you did in terms of exercise. And that they may have, administrative data may have tighter definitions than survey data. Again, questionable. But if you're looking for something complex like someone's pension benefits, how much they paid in tax, national insurance, income before or after tax, then possibly the admin data has a more accurate record than that than we can have from people's recall. Are these claims justified? Well, as statisticians, we appreciate that the data aren't free. Well, they may come free if we're lucky, but there's a big cost in cleaning, extracting, formatting, and linking data. And it's something that often users don't understand, that long cost and time between us getting the data and them getting their estimates. And they may be free for the collecting organisation, but there's extraction fees. And if we're getting data from commercial organisations, they will look to the value of that data and look to make a profit. That all the data are available, well, partly true. All the data are available for a population, but not necessarily the population of inference which we're interested in. Okay. And are the data high quality? Well, yes, because the operation requires it, but as well as non-sampling, apart from lacking sampling error, admin data do include non-sampling distortions, errors of measurement, errors of recording, and the information that you get may not be ideal for the question you're trying to answer in your research. Eurostat do acknowledge this, and David quotes from Eurostat, when European stats are based on admin data, the definitions and concepts used for admin purposes are a good approximation should be a good approximation to those required for statistical purposes. Are the data as up to date? Well, yes, but they may be for HMRC, but maybe not for you. You may not be able to get that data yet, or you may only be able to get it when it's archived in several months' time. And do they really record what people do and not what they say they do, this social reality that David refers to? Well, if transaction data doesn't require the age and gender of the person purchasing, then it won't be on the data. Yeah. And also, can we be sure that when people report to DWP or HMRC what their earnings are or what their activity is, are they giving an accurate report or what they know works? And the tighter definitions, well, those tighter definitions are tied to the original use and maybe not to your use in statistical inference. So, in the remainder of the paper, David gives 15 statistical challenges, and as I say, I've put these on a page which hopefully some of you got in front of you. His challenges are with the aim of stimulating debate and improving the analysis of admin data and encouraging methodological researchers, like us, to explore some of the important statistical problems which arise with such data. So we've got the familiar, or maybe not how they're laid out here, the familiar framework of quality. I think that should be familiar to most of you. Maybe some of the terms are switched about in the Eurostat delivery. And this is what we're all about here as statisticians, giving thought to the data quality issues. We're alert for common errors of missing data, anomalies and outliers, and those doing machine learning, we assert, are less likely to be aware of those anomalies in the data. And in the paper, David makes the assertion that over the last 20 years, most of the lessons, most of the key findings in data mining, most of the unusual structures that have been spotted are due to errors in the data. And we should assume that every data set has got errors, and we should be used to saying, when people come with the excessively clean data, what have you done about the errors? What did you do about missing data? And if they can't tell you, be worried. In the paper, David channels Tolstoy, saying that a perfect data set is perfect in its own way. Each imperfect data set is imperfect in its own way, like families. He gives the analogy here of checking whether a random number sequence is indeed random. We can check that for patterns that we expect to happen, cycles and so on, but we can't possibly check for every possible problem, every possible pattern. Data may be good for one purpose and not for another. The data may be okay for its original operational use and not for later analysis. Detected errors may be correctable, but they might not. And he asserts again in the paper, statisticians may be able to extract extraordinary things from data, but we cannot perform miracles. I think that's probably true for data scientists as well. They can extract extraordinary things from data, but also cannot perform miracles. Okay. Again, referring back to the Stats Authority, this really came from the work that Penny's done around the quality assurance of admin data. Back in 2014, the Stats Authority was surprised by the general assumption we were making that admin data can be relied upon, and we're behaving in a way that we wouldn't behave with survey data, where we might be more sceptical about the quality of the data. And Pete Das, in their paper said that when people are looking at the quality of admin data, there is almost as many approaches as there were people looking at the data, that there isn't one unified framework and people look at different aspects. So, challenge number 1, statistics teaching should cover data quality issues. As in the way we do with survey data, total survey error, we should be covering that in admin data, or all sources of data. And 90% of the work is done on cleaning the data. We have our own horror stories there. We should be doing a separate course on data quality, in which we would include things like missing data, outlier detection, included for admin data, and things like floor and ceiling effects. Challenge number 2, developing detectors for particular quality issues. Again, a technical statistical challenge, which has been explored in some areas. There's quite a good literature on outlier detection for both admin data and survey data, but admin data brings its own issues. David gives the example here of assessing people for credit. At the assessment point, they found that if we were modelling risk with credit, whether you were a homeowner or a renter would be a good indicator of the risk. This was collected at the point when people were applying for credit, but the operators realised that this wasn't particularly crucial for whether people got credit or not. So initially they're very good, and you get no missingness, and then they realise it doesn't really matter, skip over that, and then they get told to be better again and start collecting the data again. Okay. So if it doesn't matter for the operational process, people will tend to skip it. The main causes of error in VAT data were found to be scanning errors, unit errors, incorrect quarterly data, errors in individual responses, what you'd expect to see. And David talks about the 80-20 rule, where perhaps 80% of these errors can be corrected with a minimum amount of effort, but then there remains the other 20 which take a lot of effort. And he points out that we can cross-check with other admin data, but unlike the survey world, there's typically fewer other variables with which to check. Admin data tend to have fewer variables for cross-referencing. The third challenge, I'll try and get through them a bit quicker, honest. Constructing quality metrics and quality scorecards for data sets. Again, a technical challenge, but as with challenge number 2. Now here he's saying what we need is actually measures, like we'd have the response rate for a survey, measures which we can agree on for the quality of the data. This is different to the quality assurance toolkit, where we look at whether people have followed quality assurance processes and understanding the process in places, actually getting quantitative measures of how good the data are. And we should apply those quality measures, audit data sources, audit the traditional sources, but also the other sources we're proposing to use, things like scanner data, intensive care unit data, monitoring individuals. Actually think about what is the motivation of the individuals as they input the data. We need to be aware of time series discontinuities. stuff of official statistics, of course. He gives the example here about whether we should care. Regulation in the financial markets will have an effect on our series. It depends whether it's going to bias our series. If the regulation means that we can't measure the thing we wanted to measure as well, then we may have to make a bias correction. If the regulation leads to a change in behaviour and we're interested in that change of behaviour, then we're okay, because we can measure it from the admin data. So is the change relevant? Okay. And this measure of bias and time series discontinuities is reflected in what we know already from how to treat outliers. Do we eliminate those outliers from the data and reanalyze the clean data, or do we actually expand the model and use things like time series models to account for that bias as we go on? Okay. Oops, I missed a bit there. Challenge number 6, evaluating the impact of data quality on statistical conclusions. One of the examples David gives here in his slides is using sensitivity analysis. Are the qualitative conclusions of our statistical inference influenced by data, error in the data? If we've got a small error in the percentage of diagnoses, or if the currency conversion is a little bit wrong, does it qualitatively affect our inference from the data? Or is it just that it shifts things a little bit? And then we come on to the data equals all. Are the data that we've got, because they're big data, is n equals all in the data? And he asserts that this is a fundamental misconception even for admin data. And this is largely around the difference between the target population for inference and the population which is covered by the admin data, susceptible to whatever we're doing with the admin data. So the next challenge is exploring the potential sources of non-representativeness in the data. And a real kind of key message, and I think this is true for any data we use, is understanding how the data have arrived from out there in the real population or the real economy and have arrived in the database on our desktop. Traditionally, we'd think about things like non-response error and the propensity of different people to respond. Here it's a bit different because the mechanisms are not due to the people wanting to respond largely, but whether they were intended to be included in the first place. Some further examples here is things like credit scorecards. We might be looking to look at people's whether we should give them credit or not based on a score. The information we've got about the risk there is largely about people who apply for credit. So we've already got a biased data set, excluding those people who know they'd have no chance. We're aware of biases in things like journal papers. Some research doesn't get published. It may be put in the counter-argument to what does get published. And in things like crime maps, David raises the possibility that knowing that reporting antisocial behaviour or crime in your area will get put on a map, including your address, you may be reluctant to actually report that crime because of how the area is viewed and the cost of your house. And when we're looking at a company, we may have records of all the employees, customers and transactions, but that's the population now. Does that give us some inference into the future? And he quotes Campbell's law that if we use any quantitative social indicator for decision making and for targeting, then that will affect the behaviour of people. If you know that you can't get a benefit if you say something, then you won't say that thing. So we need to develop and adopt tools for adjusting conclusions in the light of the data selection process. It builds on challenge 7, identifying those selection biases. There is work on this, things like econometric work, like Heckman models, looking at the probability of inclusion and then inference-based conditional on that inclusion. We do have resolution strategies, but these make assumptions about the mechanisms involved and the distributional forms. Again, David says that statisticians are good, but they can't work miracles. He suggests also the possibility that you may want to capture a sample which is a sample of those people who don't apply for credit. So you get some idea about the bias of those who apply for credit and your model based on those people alone. Okay. And we need to think about how these methods apply to admin data. Challenge 9. Does the admin data answer the questions that we've got? Identify their limitations and be wary of definitions over time. We construct survey questions deliberately to answer the questions that cost money, but they are designed and tailored and tested for the questions that we are measuring. The example here, one example is for the crime survey for England and Wales, designed to collect victim reports of crime, and we get a very different message from the crime survey for England and Wales compared with police recorded crime. Not only that, but the trends are in different directions. And there are good reasons for this, in the data collection, and the motivations of those collecting police recorded crime. We've had our own experience of this in the ONS, comparing DWP's national insurance registrations of overseas nationals, which lead to very different and rather alarmist reports of the level of immigration compared with the official source, which is based on the International Passenger Survey. LTIM there is long-term international migration. These can be explained by definitional differences and why the data are collected and why people are applying for national insurance numbers, but it's not easy to triangulate and reconcile the two sets of data. And although ONS did a reasonable job last year, there are some uncertainties there. From David's own work on modelling expenditure with credit cards, he found that there are complications in the data which come from another behavioural thing. This was people at petrol stations, and we get these rather odd little peaks, like we all do. We're going to put 20 quid in the car, we're going to put 50 quid in the car, and we get these massive peaks here. Also peaks around 99 pence and 1.99 due to pricing structures. Further complications and further cleaning. We can't predict all the questions that are going to be asked of admin data in the future, especially when the data are going to be linked to other sources where they bring in extra value. The key thing here, something we say a lot, is involve statisticians where possible at the collection phase or in the quality assurance of the data. And here he quotes R.A. Fisher, which is another one off the board here, with a familiar quote. Which most of you are familiar with. Okay. Too late once the patient's died. Okay. Reporting changes with time series. Transaction data is essentially good for measuring data changes over time. It's collected continuously in the nature of transactions. But recall again the data mining conclusion. Most unusual features arise from data errors. Okay, so be skeptical, have a good close look. We're asked to put the observed change in the context of the inaccuracy of measurement, which is in a sense one of the things that David says that we do as statisticians. We look for the patterns in the context of the uncertainty. Okay. One thing to be aware of, and particularly that in the sense that admin data are largely observational data and not set up to establish causal links, is that we may not be able to infer causality from the data. There occasionally are admin data sets, things like the MOJ Justice Data Laboratory, where there are interventions put and admin data are used to collect the outcomes, but they're fairly rare, they tend to be expensive, and they affect the processes of the administration itself, and therefore they are rare. We then go on to linking and combining data. Here David gives three main reasons to provide complementary data. So we might link in attitudinal data from surveys to give us the extra depth that admin data can't give us alone. We may add in data to provide supplementary evidence. Perhaps the admin data points us to the right research questions, gives us the broader view, and then we hone in with survey questions or survey research. And maybe the admin data gives us that benefit. We can use regression estimation to take our national estimates and infer for smaller areas or smaller domains within the population. And also for triangulation and verification, if we can get a set of statistics, perhaps based on national insurance numbers and the IPS and other sources, and triangulate and verify those together, we can get one set of coherent statistics which are better than the others taken aside. And he says here we can learn from medicine, where there is a building tradition in linking medical images, clinical trial reports, epidemiological data, and also doing meta-analysis across different medical sources. Accurate sources does not mean accurate linked data. From a different paper from David Hand and Kristen here, he makes this comment here. And he also quotes Vaju et al. From 2015, looking at economic data and recognizing that there's a lot of reasons why different economic data from different nations may differ because of the national legal and institutional environments, the different trade-offs that different countries make between quality dimensions and between cost and benefits, and the methodological choices. We're all doing different things in different countries. Okay. So this raises the next three challenges all on one slide. The risks associated with linked data sets and the possibility that linked data sets have extra error in them than the individual admin data sets on their own. Trying to develop statistical principles, principled sound methods for record linkage, building on the deterministic and probabilistic tradition that we've used, looking at the new sources of data as well, and new methods for data triangulation for combining different sources. Okay. Finally, the last challenge he lists is around anonymization and de-identification. There's a particular concern about this because we don't have much choice about whether we're including admin data typically. If we want benefits, if we want to pay our taxes, if we have to pay our taxes. We leave a data shadow and people are concerned about that. Admin data has to have the identifying information so that transactions can be linked to accounts and so on. This makes us nervous about being identified within there. Okay, so just a few points to conclude. David includes in his slide other issues, issues around the communication of uncertainty, as he mentioned earlier, extracting meaning in and from the data whilst handling uncertainty. So looking for the patterns but acknowledging that there is uncertainty around those. Communicating and the understanding of uncertainty, and he gives an example here really about risk. I may say it's got a 90% chance of rain tomorrow. It may not rain tomorrow. That doesn't mean I was wrong with my prediction. Quite difficult to get across to the public. And further communication of understanding. Not quite sure how to read this one. Complex problems have simple, easy to understand, but wrong answers. So we need to link through from the complex issues to answers that people can understand. Okay, so in summary, 15 statistical challenges around data quality, around teaching about that, teaching people about the collection of admin data in the way that we have done for so long with survey data, deriving quality measures for admin data and applying those, quantitative qualitative measures, exploring non-representativeness, not because people don't want to take part, but because people are never going to be included in the data, and what to do about it in our inference, and tying the admin data to the actual questions which we want to answer. Thank you.
Yes, it's my privilege to be invited here tonight to propose thanks to David. It's a real shame that he's not here, I'm sure you'll agree, but Charles, you've done an excellent job of walking us through the slides, but it is an excellent paper, and I'm very pleased to be able to be here tonight. What I'd like to do in the few moments that I've been given is to give you some of my observations, my personal observations from thinking about the quality of admin data, kind of from an official statistics perspective. I should declare, you'll see from the top of my slide, that I work in the Office for Statistics Regulation, and I'm part of the regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority. And I feel like I'm getting on a bit now. I've actually had quite a long career working within official statistics, and actually most of that time has actually been spent working with admin data, from births and cancer registrations. Police recorded crime was actually the last job that I did before I joined the UK Stats Authority. So it's with great interest that I read David's paper. And yeah, I've pulled out some observations, some of the points David himself has made in his slides. But I want to give a kind of a little bit of an angle on the official stats perspective. And this is partly based on the work that David references in relation to our work on the quality assurance of admin data. You'll hear me give our nickname, Quad, QAAD. Forgive me for that, but it's just such a long title otherwise. But when I do mention it, that it's our work in speaking around, thinking around these issues of understanding the quality of admin data for our work within official statistics and ensuring sort of the quality of the information and that it's valuable in the way it's being used. So, some perspectives. I'm not sure where I'm aiming. Yeah, here we go. I wanted to start with a quote. Oh, excuse me. I would like to start with a quote from David's paper. So, I did actually see the draft, and I was hurriedly looking through to make sure it was still in the paper, and I've no idea if it is or not, but I think it's an excellent quote. And for me, it pulls out three important aspects. So you'll see within this quote, quality, you'll see data, and most importantly, you'll see use. And I think in the way that it's actually bringing together these constructs, it actually is a very important way of actually thinking about the importance of why we need to understand the nature of data, but also that, as pointed out in this quote, it's talking about the data set as a collective, and what does that mean for ultimately the use of the information. So this is going to be some of the angles that I'd like to touch on as we go forward. And I'm actually going to be pulling out a few of the things that you'll have heard, but as I say, hopefully with that twist on official stats. So 3 points that David makes that really struck a chord for me. Data may be good for one purpose, but bad for another. That's all around the use of the information. So you need to understand the data that you're working with, but you also need to understand the use for which it's being put. And that may be partly your use. You may be the analyst, and it may be the work that you're carrying out. But within the official stats world, actually, there may be people within your organization that you're producing the information for, but there are actually a whole range of other users. And within official stats, we've got to think about the community of users. So we actually have to have a much wider perspective on use. One can never be sure that all errors have been detected. I think that's a really sobering reminder. For any analyst working in whatever field they're working with data, you can never be sure. Your job never ends in trying to understand the data and quality assure and be sure, looking at the data, testing it, does it make sense, sense checking it, even when you've actually completed your work. I think we're going to come to a point in a minute that I learned very early on as a junior researcher. But yes, your job never ends in quality assurance. Quality issues can arise when data of adequate quality are merged. This point was made earlier on in David's presentation, but what's really important there for me is that it's helping us think around the process. It's throughout that process of working with data and producing statistics. And it's not just about the data, it's not just about the method. Actually, it can also be about you as the analyst, you working with the data, and what do you bring to it, and what biases almost do you actually bring to their data as well. There could be times when you're actually introducing a problem. So actually being mindful of that entire process is actually very important. There are a number of misconceptions that David highlighted. And again, just to pull out some, and this one is highlighting a tip that he suggests. And absolutely right, data collected for operational reasons will be complete and error-free. Complete misconception. And it's really only when you look at why the data have been collected, how the data have been collected, when you actually get a better feel, when you actually ask questions and actually, it can actually be very easy, even for thinking around things like death registrations. One of the early kind of registration data that I worked with, and from the outside, you, as an innocent, you might be thinking, well, that's fairly straightforward, isn't it? You know, your registration system, everybody has to register the notification of a death within a short period of time of the event. How difficult can that be? But of course, as soon as you then think about your use and what information are you needing within that registration, you can begin to see that actually there's all kinds of information within that registration that can actually be of variable quality. So the information about the occupation of the person, or if you're thinking about the cause of death, and who's actually made the judgment about it, and what kind of information was actually being used at the point about what were the elements or the nature of the cause, and the secondary impact that might have had in leading to death. So something that from the outset can seem very simple and straightforward actually isn't necessarily when you probe. And the critical thing that I really like about the tip, I nearly called these handy tips, and I thought, no, that's probably not too sufficiently serious for the occasion, but ask data providers, David's suggesting here around how they've handled missing values, absolutely do, but ask data providers, and that for me was one of the things that really stood out, was asking and was probing and challenging, and definitely be suspicious of anything that seems perfect. Yeah, we've heard data is all. This has been mentioned. And I think that one of the in terms of official statistics, that you can be thinking about some of the particular challenges that are being faced by official stats producers. This reminded me of some of the challenges, say, for example, within the benefit system for DWP and having to manage different policies. You can think from at one point, I was thinking about child maintenance was one example that popped into my mind, that there you've got a situation in which you're moving from one scheme into another scheme, bit like universal credit. It wasn't actually the case that one policy ends and the next one starts, and that, of course, just changing policies can have step changes. But here you actually don't have that situation. You've actually got a collective where you've got the entire group of people in the population who are actually in this circumstance, whether it's universal credit or with the child maintenance, actually on different schemes. And so if you're trying to understand what does this represent within the population, you actually have to allow for the fact it isn't necessarily one data source, it could be two data sources that are actually relevant for the population. So you could be looking at a subset thinking that you're actually counting everything or understanding everything about that experience, but it's actually not the case. So understanding the complexities of the policy that is actually being carried out and what does that mean for the measurement is incredibly important. And so there real complexities within dealing within official statistics. And definitely the points that were at the end of David's presentation about communicating it and understanding it are paramount. And then the final one, oh no, I wanted to mention, this is actually one I added. It was, the last line isn't actually David's, so I put this in myself. I probably nicked it from somebody, so apologies to whoever I've stolen it from. But the thing that struck me, not just data equals all, was actually that don't forget, data is plural. And one of the things, of course, that you have, I think I was reading the Data Protection Act the other day. I'm working on the Code of Practice for Statistics, so it's something I've been reading a lot about in terms of data governance. But again, it struck me there that they were talking about data being plural, not forgetting it. Of course, in common language today, it can be used singular or plural. But the critical thing here is that it can be easy to be thinking that data are homogeneous. You talk about data or a data source, and that everything within that source is actually going to be the same or of the same quality. It's not the case at all, is it? Just thinking back to those death registrations I mentioned, the fact that actually the occupation information could be quite incomplete compared with other information. Even within one record for a person, you've got variable information. You've got variable motivations about the information that's being provided at the point it's being collected. So there's a danger, again, that when we just think about data, that somehow that it's all is universal and that it's going to have the same characteristics, and that's absolutely not the case, is it? So very complex. And then with this common misconception that data errors will only affect a small part of the data set. I'm not sure this was mentioned in David's presentation, but it's within the paper. And I think this is in effect, this is actually one of the incredibly important things that admin data offer us, that we actually are able to very often go to a much lower level of detail than you can with maybe survey information. And so that's incredibly important. But it can also mean that if you do have errors, that actually that may be very relevant for your area of investigation. So you've got to bear that in mind, that actually those few areas actually may be incredibly important. So I said I would mention quad, and I'm really mindful of my time. I have no idea how much time I've got left. David is such enraptured with my presentation, it's completely forgotten. I'll try. I know there's an awful lot of people who are very interested in speaking, so I just want to say very briefly so those of you who have not heard about Quad, if you can get my slides, I've got 2 minutes left. So if I can plug the work that we've done on the quality assurance of admin data, hopefully you will find it of interest. But if you do get the slides, there are actually a couple of links, so it can take you straight there. But just to say that the critical thing that Quad tries to do, and what it's doing is speaking to official stats producers, but it's also speaking to us. I work in the part that is dealing with the regulation. So I'm making judgments about how well does an official stats producer comply with the code of practice. Bottom line of the Quad is to answer these 2 questions. How do you know that the data are sufficiently reliable and suitable to be used to produce official statistics? That's a question we want producers to be asking themselves of the information that they're working with. And then the other part is then to ask themselves, what do users need to know about the quality to use the statistics appropriately? If you can answer those questions, the Quad is all around challenge, it's all around probing, and it's exactly what David said. It's not giving you quality indicators per se, it's helping producers ask the questions. And we actually think they are questions that if you are also using admin data, and we hope that many of you will be, say through the Admin Data Research Network, as that grows, that those challenges are also real for you too. So do ask questions, do probe, and I hope you will have many happy days actually working with admin data. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank the opportunity to be able to discuss this, I think, a timely and you might say thought-provoking paper. And as the author mentioned himself in the paper, sort of the topic being such a broad one, it's probably quite difficult for a single paper to cover all the ground. Sorry? 10 minutes. Okay, so I'll be quick. So I'll be focusing on 2 points, I think, which the paper touches on, but probably in some sense didn't really press home the message. Okay, let me see. How do I go? Yeah, I'll start with a quote. On the one hand, there is an established tradition to use admin data for the creation of sampling frames and for providing auxiliary information in data collection, editing, imputation, estimation. On the other hand, more and more often, the data from admin sources are being directly transformed into statistical data, either in place of purposely collected census or survey data, or to combine with the latter. What I want to say is that it is in particular in the latter respect, when the admin data are used directly as replacement or as part of the statistical data, where the theoretical challenge arises. Now, in terms of this theoretical challenge, I think Heinz's paper document very well about the reuse aspect, all the things that come with the reuse of it. But I want to go a bit further back in terms of the changing paradigm to say that there is actually the other aspects of this reuse that is perhaps not stressed enough. There is this representative method, if you recall. It's like the promoter sort of the first time about 100 years ago more, sort of basically the idea is to say that even for descriptive statistics, it's not necessary with a census. You can do with just a sample. That is the first paradigm shift, in a way. Right? And then but the theory didn't come until, the sampling theory didn't really come until Neyman's paper. Around 60, 70, with the big machine, with the admin sort of systems that's coming in, the digital sort of big machine sort of revolution, it comes a second paradigm shift, which is leading to the current stage in many Nordic countries and other so-called register-rich countries, which in a sense is to say that I'm going to separate data capture from statistical production. That is a key thing, the paradigm shift. Instead of saying, I have a question and go out and purposely collect the data that's suitable for that, to answer that question, that is a very valuable scientific approach, but it's not a very effective or very flexible approach. The new way of looking at it is, on the one hand, you have to capture and curate the data as the data is generated, without necessarily a particular pipeline output already there. On the other hand, you should process and take out the analysis as the needs arise. It's a separation of this thing that is a new paradigm shift that has driven the last 40 years or 50 years of this admin data uptake in the registered countries. So this paradigm shift says that apparently, one thing is obvious, is to say that the data will be repurposed and reused because they were generated, not collected for a particular question. They were generated as such. On the other hand, because the data was not purposely collected, they probably, you won't be so lucky to just find the data that exactly answer your question. Yeah, big data is called fun data. How can you be so lucky that you just find the data that exactly address the question? So in order to do anything useful, you probably have to resort to what we call a combination of sources, a combination of methods. This is the other side of the reuse that is probably not clear enough in the message in the paper, I think. Okay? Now, when it comes to the years, there has been developed some kind of framework, total error framework, for this data integration perspective. So this is the first phase, which you're probably familiar with the survey sort of context, and it's been applicable to admin data as such. So any data was generated for whatever the well-defined ways. So basically, if you can imagine the data with n times p, so there is issues with the n's, and there's issues with the p's. So that's the two axes you're going along. What happens is that there is a second phase of integration when it comes to use of admin data, big data, or whatever, because the data was not directly collected for that purpose. So there's a second phase issue that's coming in. When the multiple data sets are put together, there is a second round of problem about this. So these are the things that's been going on, but I think was not clear enough in the paper. And some other relevant sort of recent developments, whether it's from the data configuration angle to put an overview and the associated methods, or to look at the things that you actually need to do with the data. Maybe you need to link the data, you match the data without common units, you have to do something about the measurement. All these different ways of structuring the things you could come into. There are some sort of developments going on, particularly in Europe, on the continent, in Netherlands, in Italy, and many other countries. So these are the overviews. I give you some reference that people could. So I'm now going to, because of time, I'm going to go on to the other issue, which I think is particularly thorny, is to say that yes, we're going to use better methods. Yes, because the data are not collected by a controlled process. Put it this way, it's not properly sampling, it's not experimental design. So modeling is necessary, which raises the issue in the official statistics, is to say that what is, coming back, the validity of a model-based approach to a descriptive target. We're coming back to this question. This question has been the debate in 60s and 70s and so on and so forth. The model-based was not today the predominant mode of production. I think partly is because the model-based approach was never able to address this validation issue properly. If they had been able to address this issue properly, we would be using model-based methods already. But the problem is quite, how would you say, nuanced, because you have to differ between the use and the requirement. I think there are much of the use that you see today with big data, secondary use of things, they are directly connected to some kind of tangible losses. So maybe if you increase your sales by 2%, which amounts to $2 billion, you don't really care if the method is statistically valid or not. Why should you? If your analysis helped to send the aid out to the people in need, you don't really care if this method is not really, statistically speaking, well defined or whatever. There are use of data which is what you might call in the philosophical, sort of in the philosophy change, sort of ordinary language philosophy is changing in the last turn of the last century, is to say, stop asking the question, what does word mean? Start to ask the question, what does the word do? Okay, today I think you're facing the same thing. And this problem, I think, is touching the statistical science as general. It's beyond official statistics. Basically, it's to say that you can do things without necessarily hitting on truth. Okay, so this is a bit broader picture. Now, putting aside these uses, you can come back to the second type of uses, which is called analytic or inferential. Yes, thank you. Your target is analytic, and therefore the validation issue is also different. The descriptive is so hard, it's because it requires a truth of a black-white type. So if you have an instantaneous census, perfect census, you should get that number. Now, does your model-based alternative method hit on that number? In what sense can your inference about the uncertainty around that number is right? And this, I think, we're facing the big problem in the sense that the statistics was developed using asymptotics to justify methods which is primarily aimed at small sample efficiency. That's the tradition of statistics. So the validity, the unbiasedness, and consistency are usually defined by convenience. You assume it will be like this. Now, as long as your sampling variability is going to dominate your misspecification in terms of the target, the bias issue, you're going to get away with it. It's okay. You can live with it. It's a useful approach. With big data, with large amount of data, the bias dominates the variance. And therefore, how can you make inference in a way that is sound in this context? This is the big issue. And this is the issue is going to be going beyond official statistics. It's statistics as a science in general is facing this issue. And I think maybe we will have to, I didn't have time to go to these questions in terms of the whether you would be able to do this. I think mostly you wouldn't be able to validate sort of the validity in how would you say, traditional way to say that this kind of convergence asymptotic results you will get. It's very unlikely that your model will be hitting on just like that. Given that, if that's not the case, how would you do? I think you will need to consider the use of some kind of auditing survey. You need to collect additional data. So we're coming back to survey, but survey is not as a primary mode to collect, but some kind of survey, some kind of auditing survey in order to do this. However, how to do that? What does it mean to validate something? I think that question is difficult. We have to spell it out. And once you're able to spell it out, I think you have a chance to bring that uncertainty, the validation uncertainty, rather than the initial sampling uncertainty. It's a validation uncertainty that's ultimately built into our inference that can handle this thing, I think. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you, Michael and Charles, and best wishes to David for a speedy recovery. On first reading this paper, I was skeptical that administrative data needed their own theory. To draw on David's opening sentence, surely survey data are, like administrative data, generated during the course of some operation. The operation, in this case, being the construction and delivery of a structured exercise to collect predefined data. But as David carefully points out, there are crucial differences between administrative data and survey or census data. So I welcome this paper, but not so much as launching a drive for theory, but aiming for a set of ethics and a culture around the use of data, establishing practices and ways of doing things, including with standard and robust tools and methods that underpin the quality of the analyses and applications of the data from whatever source. David, of course, recognises that understanding the use to which statistics are to be put is a crucial part of assessing quality of data. What flows from that, it seems to me, is that gathering and understanding users' requirements would make a good starting point before, to quote from the paper, statisticians are gathered to discuss the need for methodological statistical work on administrative data. An example of this was the 1995 Royal Statistical Society Working Party on the measurement of unemployment in the UK, in which I played a part. The Working Party consulted widely in this country and abroad, particularly to understand the views of users of the administrative and the survey sources then available. Our recommendations, including that the headline measure should be based on a survey rather than on the administrative count of claimants. But would this be different today, given, for example, the widely documented decline in survey response rates? Being clearer about the potential use and value of administrative data might also help with resolving a logjam that is currently seen, because costs and benefits of processing administrative data for statistical purposes fall in different places and often to different organisations. Finally, many of the challenges and opportunities discussed in David's excellent paper have long-standing parallels in the secondary analysis of survey data, from where I think lessons can be learned. For example, Catherine Hackin's 1982 paper included the encouragement of more collaborative research of one of the benefits. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for inviting us to RSS. It is nice to meet so many British colleagues. It is a pity that David Hand is not here, so we could meet him also. Well, we come from Statistics Sweden, and as you know, the Nordic countries use quite a lot of administrative registers to produce their statistics. And the statistical challenges that David mentioned in his paper, there is one challenge that has been central for us statisticians in the Nordic countries that is missing here. I just want to point out that missing challenge. Well, David has a title, Administrative Data. I would prefer to have the term administrative register, because a register is something more than just a heap of data. Register is generated by an administrative process, and the administrative objects are handled, and they have, as a rule, identity numbers of one or different kinds. So that is important, these identity numbers. David mentions quite a lot of challenges, and I have not time to discuss them all, so I will confine myself on official statistics. And first, I want to say, a register, how important can registers be for statistical surveys? And here I have one example from Sweden. Before 1968, Sweden belonged to the group of European countries that had the worst agricultural statistics. In 1968, Statistics Sweden had developed a new register, the farm register. And since then, now Sweden belongs to the group of European countries with the best agricultural statistics. So here you see the farm register, not only itself, it could improve the whole system of agricultural surveys. And that is an important issue. And the next thing, is there a general conclusion? Can the whole system of surveys used for official statistics be improved by administrative registers? And our answer on this question, based on our experiences from the Nordic countries and other countries, is a clear yes. So the administrative registers can be used to improve the entire national statistical system. And so we would like that David could add to his 15 challenges, he could add this number 16. How can we improve the entire system? Here we have David's challenges, and here we have added number 16. But now you face a problem. If you want to use administrative registers to improve the national statistical system, then you immediately find that the administrative data is not good enough. So to improve the statistical system, you must start by improving the administration in your country. And that the Nordic statisticians have spent quite a lot of effort in doing that. What has happened in the Nordic countries, our way of using administrative registers has changed our production system completely, from a traditional one without registers into a completely register-based production system. And that change David could discuss. We met one colleague at a conference. He was very happy. We have been able to do record linkage between the census and some taxation data, and we have so much as 90% match. And we could tell him that, but why do you match with the census only? Why you could create an income register and publish yearly register-based income statistics. And 90% match, that will not work. If you want to produce official statistics, you must have 100% match. Because when we produce our statistical register, we do not do one record linkage operation, we do many. And then 90% will not work at all. So,
I'm afraid I must stop you.
yes, but there is no escape from this hard work of improving all your administrative registers.
Like everyone else, I'd like to thank David and wish it for the paper. very timely, raises some challenging issues, and also I'd like to wish him well and hope he recovers soon. The first thing I will say is administrative data are a good thing. Sort of end of story, really. But the reason I say that is because my background is almost entirely in the commercial sector, dealing with primarily administrative data sets, pretty much hardly any sample-based data. Now, David made these points, some of the advantages. From a commercial point of view, as far as I'm concerned, these are the most important. They all have footnotes and caveats, which David also raised, but who cares? Every data set has problems, issues, caveats. It's just another set with an administrative data set. And possibly the theory isn't worked out, but we can't let theory get in the way of practical application. It was you, I think, who said, if it produces a practical answer, we don't really care that the statistics might not be exactly theoretically sound. But one thing, Anders has just talked about adding a 16th challenge. Can I add a 17th, please, to David's list? He sort of alludes to this, but he doesn't really emphasize the importance of domain knowledge. Now, we as statisticians know how important it is to understand our data. We know about analytical methods. We cannot possibly know about every domain. We cannot possibly know about every data set. So we have to be good at getting this information. And I would also say, certainly I and the people I know probably have detailed knowledge of very few domains, actually. So when we get a new data set, when we get a new administrative data set, for me the most important thing to start with is understanding those data. Which means we need to talk to the people who own those data. Because I've heard all these good things about administrative, public use data sets, public data sets, official registers. They're great, but I deal with commercial data sets. And for the last 15 odd years, I've been a consultant trying to get access to other people's data. They own those data. I need to persuade them why they should give me access to those data sets. So we have to find out about the domain, and we actually have to negotiate to get hold of those data. And the final point really is echoing yours. There's rarely enough time to develop the best model, whatever we do. And this really fits with what Penny said as well. The final point on here, we must understand all of the client's domain knowledge. We have to be very good at asking questions. We have to be very good at probing. Because if we don't, we will make mistakes. So in a sense, for me, we need to develop another skill. I won't actually add another challenge to the list. But for me, the most important part of influencing, so how do we get to understand the data? How do we, thank you, how do we get all of the domain knowledge from our clients? Is that we actually have to understand what they want. What are they trying to do with these data? Now, pretty much everybody has said one of the problems with administrative data is that they were collected for a reason, usually to run a business in my case, not to answer statistical questions. So we need to find out what does the client want to do with these data sets. And we have to engage in debate at fairly senior levels. And finally, I just want to show you two data sets. The one on the left is the same source. It's exactly the same data set that David and I worked on for the petrol station data set that Charles described of penny values. This is at pound values. The data set so it's petrol station transactions, how much are people spending? The outlier to this data set, if it's an outlier, which it's not really, but we can come back to that if you have the time, is at actually £4,495. Way off there. I've just truncated it so you can see the peaks. But these peaks are at exact values of 10, 15, 20 pounds. And the reason I wanted to show you that and compare it to the one on the right, that is also based on consumer behavior. Both of these data sets are measuring consumer behavior at just one remove. I have a data set, or I have two data sets, that actually show me what consumers have been doing. But the one on the right, many of those peaks are deterministic. Many of them are partly deterministic, partly down to consumer behavior, so the stochastic process. But actually working with the client to find out which parts of which data sets and which peaks are deterministic and which parts are stochastic is a non-trivial problem, which is why the influencing, the probing questions is crucial from my point of view. Thank you.
So thank you to David and Charles for presenting the paper, a very wide-ranging paper. My background is drug development, but also some work in economic statistics and social science. I was on the ADRN with David, so my comments are within that context. Three main areas I want to touch on. One is randomization and surveys. The second one is around pre-specification and sensitivity analysis, and the third one is about standardization, which I think will link into the Nordic example. So both randomized clinical trials and surveys have well-known properties that address bias in different ways. Randomization through balancing treatment groups over all randomizations with respect to factors known and unknown, measured and not measured, that may impact outcome. Surveys through sampling, there's a representation of the population. Statisticians understand these properties well, but they do not guarantee unbiased estimation. Missing data are a common problem, and untestable assumptions may lead to misinterpretation, while subject recall in diaries, for instance, alcohol consumption, can be very misleading. Somebody mentioned it before, I think. Sampling of passengers at airports may be random, but whether the answer of the expected length of stay is reliable is open to debate. I'm not sure the national insurance records are the solution either, but essentially we need to get in, and maybe the check-in, check-out process of admin data would be key there. Furthermore, randomized controlled trials and surveys may be limited in their ability to answer questions associated with long durations and complexity. Examples might include the understanding of disease trajectories over many decades and the treatment of comorbidity, where patients may be on 6 or 7 treatments at once in an aging population. Administrative data offer the potential to go deeper, for instance, using address registers, business occupation classifications in government. So my first point is we have to recognize that randomized clinical trials and surveys also have their limitations, and that administrative data, not being perfect, do present unique opportunities. The second point is around pre-specification and sensitivity analysis. My experience is that is much more common in drug development than in, say, social science research. In 2017, the European Medicines Agency set out a draft addendum to their Statistical Principles in Clinical Trials Guideline that introduces the concept of the estimand, and that translates the trial objective into a precise definition of the treatment effect to be estimated. It states that stats analysis aligned to the estimand will be associated with assumptions and data limitations that impact, the impact of which can be investigated through a sensitivity analysis. The assumptions behind and the limitations of admin data are likely to go well beyond those generated by clinical trials. And the vulnerability to so-called p-hacking is really unbounded. So my second point is to demand much more rigor in the planning and analysis of administrative data to ensure reliable decisions are made, including those at the individual level through algorithms. As David Hand points out, understanding the data, including the associated metadata, is essential, even more so for admin data. And my final point relates to the practical aspects of data linkage. One of my findings of the independent review of ONS methodology was a lack of standardization around variable naming conventions, definitions, and formats across government. Legacy systems also meant there was little appetite or capacity to add or modify variables that would produce better statistics, with no desire for increased operational complexity or expense. Data scientists, like statisticians, complain that most of their time is spent preparing data. A greater emphasis on administrative data by design, which I think is the Nordic proposal, is therefore required to bring process efficiency and improve quality, with statistics, the statistics requirement being much higher up the agenda. Thank you.
Thanks. So sorry about David. Anyway, I just want to indicate a few things which I find as really this being quite a seminal paper. And the issues are so very important in all respects. And I just want to comment a little, of course, if I can manage this. Thanks. Yeah, just a few points very quickly. Just commenting on just the general nature of what is at issue here. Homology and field is my recommendation in regards to the future and what we need to do in regard to big data analytics, which is very much based on the eminent social scientist Pierre Bourdieu and his work, and I've described that in various contexts. So I'm just going to be dealing with what is at issue here, and this is then relating specifically to the paper, which I'm not looking at the challenges but directly, but they are, of course, completely and totally included in what I am looking at. The very first one I'll just comment on in one moment's time, data encoding and data curation as being fundamental issues. Then the next one, data equals all. Well, the interaction in analytics, which is therefore not to automate analytics, but to have interaction, visualization and verbalization of data. Which is actually used in a book title, an edited book. I'll just comment on that in one moment. The next one here is the focus of analysis, very important. The quotations here, of course, are from the paper. And then, next one then is establishing causality and so on. And that is problematic for those of us who are involved in astrostatistics, because in cosmology and in astrophysics and so on, for statistics in relation to that, we don't have a chance to experiment with what is being observed, right? That, of course, gives rise to, as I would say, the biggest problem of our time, really, that the universe in which we exist in, 95% of it is dark matter and dark energy, so therefore not observed and not known from its causation and causality point of view anyway, right? That's just to be a bit humorous, really. Okay, the following thing there, section 6, combining data from different sources, triangulation. Well, triangulation from a mathematician's point of view immediately points to metric and ultrametric properties, and therefore that is very relevant from the point of view of mapping data into a latent semantic space, which is a factor space, and also hierarchical, which is hierarchical properties of the data, which is, after all, the ultrametric property, etc. Finally, this section 7 here, confidentiality, privacy, anonymization. Well, a book which has impressed me quite a bit, published in 2016. O'Neill is the author, Weapons of Math Destruction. And it's related to aspects of aggregating properties of individuals and replacing individuals by the average properties. And therefore, that is, to my mind, a relevant aspect of big data analytics in terms of ethics and the like. So, okay, just then, right, population here rather than sampling is an important issue, and that also can be associated, in my view, very, very much with resolution scale in terms of the analytics, and therefore that is just an important aspect for so many aspects. And then looking at point number 2 here, complementary to this work, I feel, is this important paper published a short time ago, Keiding and Lewis, on the bias of big data analytics, in particular from the point of view of social media. But nonetheless, I would view that as being very relevant in a complementary way, and therefore mutually supporting everything which is in this paper right now. And then the final issue here, just that, again, a quotation about that, fundamental problem that's relevant to all data analysis, that is the issue which points to context of analytics being extremely important. Okay, and then administrative data, well, just mentioning the whole aspect of, qualitative, quantitative, and so on, and therefore that ultimately is going in the direction of data encoding. And just to mention one paper published a while back on a new form of regression, ultrametric regression, where I took the so terrible social violence in Colombia and basically regressed that on drug volumes of sale and costs and so on in the United States, and had results relating, therefore, political change in Colombia and terrible social violence with the market for drugs and such like. Okay, and then just that the quotation, which actually was in one of the earlier discussions just now. Okay, and then so much current analytical work is related to data mining versus machine learning. Oh, sorry, right. Yeah, just to mention, that's a very, very important point. From the point of view of my editorial role, so much I do reject on the basis of precisely this issue, namely that there's very trivial aspects. Just mentioning the visualization and virtualization there. Sorry, okay, that's just one other thing, right? And then just another thing on contextualization, and this is related to morbidity analytics in terms of aspects of mental health, which was just published a short time ago. And then finally here, just to mention, just to mention that a book of mine published, which actually has been published just very, very recently, and I very much relate to my former supervisor of my PhD, way back in time, Jean-Paul Benzicry, and right, this quotation is very important for all of us involved in data science and big data analytics. Thank you.
I work with Stephen. As I say, he's poorly today, so he can't make it, but I've got some thoughts here. Obviously, coming from Department for Work and Pensions, it sounds as though our name or our type of data has been mentioned a couple of times already in the evening. So just a few thoughts from Stephen. So in DWP, we have a long history of using administrative data already, and so we're aware of its limitations. And so a couple of brief examples around two publications which are effectively working around some of those limitations of administrative data. So for example, we have a estimates of take-up of benefits publication where we match administrative data to survey data. That helps us to look at what benefits the survey data thinks people should be eligible for, then makes an estimate about the number of eligible non-recipients. So that's one way we're trying to incorporate some administrative data there. And then we also measure fraud and error, and there we effectively retake a sample of benefit claims and then see how many people the situation has changed. So the question for everyone really is then in terms of how you check some of the important elements of administrative data when you're outside that system, and I think that maybe touches on a couple of the things that have been said earlier. And then Stephen had noted potentially a few reflections on universal credit, which is obviously one of our new benefits in DWP. And there basically, as well as bundling a number of benefits into one single wrapper, universal credit also uses a new 21st century IT system. So for example, that means you can claim universal credit online, then in a job centre, a work coach might be asking you questions about job search online or inputting information online with the claimant, and claimants can also be replying online. So again, there's a whole lot of development in terms of how data is collected, who's inputting things, that again is maybe different from legacy benefits previously. So with the best engagement in the world, collecting data for statistics is quite low down in the priority order. Obviously, we have to prioritise making sure that people get the right benefits that they're paid at the right time. And obviously, getting that data system then to work and managing that system on a day-to-day basis is really the most important priority for the department. This whole new approach as well has been developed in the world of Agile. That may be familiar to some of you here. And so that means that we make something that works, we start using it, we learn from that, and then we improve it and change that process again. So that means that the data can change in terms of how people are working with the system. And so again, as a statistician, we need to have to keep our eye constantly almost on what that system is, how it's working, what's available, and to understand that. So that means in the 21st century, it means that administrative data in theory is much richer, but that is in theory. That's in capital letters. We've got lots of unstructured data. Stephen certainly wasn't going to be promising anything yet, but it means that issues around coherence and consistency in analysis produced by different people across a department, let alone externally from a department, are also more challenging. So maybe that's just some thoughts from a departmental perspective on some of the issues relating to administrative data. Thank you.
Professor Hand has clearly articulated the main challenges for statistical analysis of administrative data. Many of these challenges are being met by the methodological work being undertaken by the Administrative Data Research Network and the Administrative Data Research Centre for England, of which I direct both the network and the English Centre. And in my 4 minutes, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on just telling you what the Administrative Data Network is about and some of my own research. So the Administrative Data Network is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and was instigated in 2013 to facilitate access to linked administrative data. The setting up of this Administrative Data Network was a recommendation of the Administrative Data Task Force that David mentions in his paper. Because of the varying data environments across the UK, it was recommended that a centre be set up in each of the 4 constituency countries of the UK and a service to coordinate it. The Administrative Data Research Centre for England is hosted by the University of Southampton and is run in collaboration with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the University College London, the Institute of Physical Studies, and as with all of the administrative data centres, with their statistical office, so we're in collaboration with the Office for National Statistics. I won't go through this slide, but the ADRCEs provide facilities for the analysis of linked administrative data. They also provide training, which is one of the challenges that David Hand mentioned, and they undertake methodological research. I think, though it's not a challenge, one of the most important points in the paper appears in the conclusions, which is about communication. And so, how do you get communication across what is now a more complicated data journey? And we at the Administrative Data Centre for England, in collaboration with the network, have developed a guidance called the Guild Guidance, which has been recently published in the Journal of Public Health, which lays down recommendations for the data collector, the data linker, if there's linker taking on, the data analyst, and the data reporter. And for sake of saving time, I will not go through all those, but if you read the paper, there are lists of things like the population, the linkage method, the method used to correct for linkage error, etc. So that's one piece of work that I would like to draw your attention to. Another piece of work done by colleagues at Southampton is on representativeness. So again, this relates to challenge 12 regarding the risks and the measures of quality of linked data. So we have developed methods that will allow you to measure representativeness, and we've used survey data linked to census data to monitor the quality of survey data over the collection period. And what is interesting, we're finding that the representativeness does not improve if you go on do repeated calls. And so we've made recommendations that after about 4 or 5 calls in face-to-face surveys, you do not improve your representativeness. Another piece of work has been looking at how representative would the eventual linked data set be. And we can do that using the same measures of representativeness. There is interestingly that there are various, again, parts of the data process for linkage process. Often you need consent, and then you need to be able to link. So you may be people saying, yes, I'm happy for the linkage. So you may introduce bias by those who are saying, I do not want to consent. But then once you've got the consenters, you may also fail to link those. So in another piece of work that will again be published soon in the Royal Statistical Society Series A, we've broken down how the representative is affected by those who will consent and those who can then be linked. And if you want to find out more about all these projects, then you can visit the Administrative Data Research Network website. Thank you.
Well, to begin with, on behalf of Duncan and Guy and myself, I'd like to thank very much David and for Charles for the unenviable task of presenting that this evening. Now we sort of sent in quite a polite contribution in text, which I'll just paraphrase now. I'll cut out all the extra polite bits. So, first of all, we liked the paper. We thought it was good, very useful in itself, but also very useful for provoking the sort of debates we're having right now, and potentially debates about some quite potentially deep issues, especially concerning the use of repurposed data. Now, in particular, thinking about how sensible it is to just go around hoovering up all these answers, all these data, when we're not entirely sure what the questions were that they're responding to. So maybe that's something to talk about at the pub after this meeting. Our second point was that we agree wholeheartedly with David's identification of sampling theory being inadequate for informing inference with admin data. So historically, maybe we were used to bundling in a whole load of, a whole universe of unobserved factors into a single model error time. Right? It's clear that we can't do that today. You know, the sort of errors with that, or anomalies rather, or disturbances that we're seeing with automated data collection, these are introducing data artifacts that are, persistent, they're structured, and crucially, they're not going to cancel out as we collect more and more data. The third point was that in our own work, sort of echoing Li Chung perhaps, that we've bumped into difficulties because we typically don't ever have a ground truth to validate our inferences against. Nor do we have accepted metrics for scoring inferences should the truth ever appear. Right? And this is highly problematic for making arguments both either for or against any particular methodology. Personally, I'm quite interested in the role that Bayesian methods might have in these contexts, or sort of more explicitly, the lack of a role they seem to have. Often we come to these problems with good prior knowledge about the biases from different sources of data. And we also, when we finish our inference, we want to use these inferences to make decisions. Right? These are both two factors that are very well handled by Bayesian methods, yet their applicability, it seems limited. They're not discussed barely at all. Our last point is that we're quite interested in pursuing these sort of decision theoretic elements and cost theoretic elements, because including admin data does come at a cost, and we do stand potentially maybe to gain through tighter inferences, but this is not guaranteed. There's sort of a cost analysis element, sort of meta-analysis is needed, and something that we'd like to encourage work on. And I think I can stop early. Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so my name's Jamie Moore. I work for the Administrative Data Research Centre for England and also for the University of Southampton. This is talking about some work I've done with my PIs, Peter Smith and Gabby Jerome. Okay, so Professor Hand's paper is an authoritative overview, and as several people have mentioned today, particularly timely in the UK context, given recent legislation, the Digital Economy Act, which gives us access to more data as an academic, hopefully. In the paper, we're particularly interested to read the section on the challenges surrounding combining data from different sources. Between source differences in definitions, categorizations and periodicities are mentioned. In addition, further discrepancies between sources are noted, particularly Romanov and Goodman's work in 2013 on some Israeli data demonstrating biases between survey and administrative income estimates. What they put this down to is actually recall problems in the survey, because people can't actually remember the figures in the same way that they were recorded in like tax records or something like that. Now, as our own research on what we term differential reporting in the UK Census and social surveys illustrates, there's a paper that's in preparation at the moment, we feel this point deserves emphasis. The research that we've undertaken here is of substantive importance because it's been proposed that the census and the surveys be combined to produce between census estimates of certain population characteristics. However, in the little bit of the work that's been done so far, differences in contemporaneous summary estimates between the sources have been found. So we need to address that, look into that further. Now, what we basically got is what's known as the Census Non-Response Link Study. This is something that Peter touched upon earlier. Basically, it's survey sample, the survey samples link back to the census so we can get information on the non-respondents. But obviously what we've also got there is responses to survey item responses and then responses to the same items in the census, so we can actually compare these responses here. Now, this example here is regarding highest qualifications reporting, and the example is a qualifications level called Nqf2, which is about A-level kind of sort of thing. Now, what we find here is that there's a hell of a lot of differential reporting between the census and the survey. So the fourth from the left pair of columns there is the Nqf2 column. Basically, that shows the probability of the response being the same in census and survey, and you can see it's about 0.6 for people with no potential foreign qualifications. It's about 0.4 for people with potential foreign qualifications, and you can also see that there's a lot of variation across those categories. So in effect, what we're finding here is that you're more likely to do these differential reporting if you've got foreign qualifications. Now, the second one we looked at is ethnicity as well. Now, this is a similar analysis. What we've looked at here, due to statistical disclosure problems, we've not been able to look at the exact, basically somebody's answered differently in census and survey. We can't pin it down to exactly what they say because I can't report on that. The numbers are too low. So what we've looked at is basically if somebody reports the same in census and survey, differently, but within the same ethnic category. So this is kind of white English, white Scottish, white Welsh. Or alternatively, across categories. So you reported, say, Asian in the census and then black in the survey. What we find, as you can see, the patterns for white, Asian and black, which is the first on the left and the second two on the right, are more or less the same. The vast majority of the time people actually get the same answer, give the same answer in census and survey. You get a small number that actually give different answers. What you tend to find there is that you actually see leaps across these broad categories. What's particularly interesting here, though, is the mixed race category, because what we find is that vast majority, an awful lot of differential reporting going on, and particularly, which actually makes sense if you think about ethnic categories, what you tend to find is that if somebody reports differently, they're going to report in a different ethnic category, which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because you're unlikely to report, say, you're white Asian in the census and then report you're white black in the survey. But what you might well do is report that you're white Asian in the census and then Asian in the survey. Now, what we think this is down to is it's down to survey interviewer probing. Basically, with the highest qualifications thing, particularly with the foreign qualifications being mediated by foreign qualifications, what it comes down to is people don't actually understand the question that they're being asked in the census. And when you're being interviewed in the survey, you've actually got somebody asking you questions. You can dig out exactly what those qualifications are that you've got and how they tally into these categories. Similarly, but also slightly differently with the ethnicity thing, I think it's a perception difference. Just because the National Statistical Institute categorises you in this particular ethnicity doesn't actually mean that you perceive yourself in that ethnicity as well. Now, the key point to this is that actually when we're combining data sources, differential reporting is likely to be common because often this is recorded in different ways. You know, the census is self-reported. That is the point. I should have made that point. So you actually have to answer those questions on your own. Whereas in a survey, you're going to get some help. That's going to happen an awful lot if we're combining data sets to improve estimation. So the challenge that I would actually add, I think it's probably more a refinement to David's challenge, is that now we need to incorporate such factors like this into estimation if we're going to use this data. Okay, that's me done. Thank you.
It's very kind of you to call me doctor, but I'm not one. That's okay. Thanks. I just wanted to thank David as well for his paper, which generates quite a lot of comments for discussion. And Ray Chambers and I, between us, would like to just pick up one point that comes out of that. It's back to the linked data sets that several other people have picked up. So In the case where there's not a unique identifier in your data set, then you might be relying on statistical linkage of some sort. So I accept that you might fix your system so that you do get fantastic linkage because we've sorted out administration. But on the whole, we're going to have to deal with cases where that's not true. There is a large literature on linkage methods, and David mentions them, and some of those components are probabilistic linkages, which means that some linkages are either going to be made or missed in error, and we're not going to get everything right all of the time. So in many linked data sets, linkage errors are going to be a component of what we see. And we've seen already a large increase in the number of analyses and number of linked data sources that are available, but not so much information on how to handle linkage errors in those analyses. There is indeed an old paper by Nita et al. In 1965, and they define a new random variable for a linked data set, and they call it yi star. Basically, that's the correct link made. So yi star is yi with a probability lambda, which you hope will be rather high, so that you make the correct link most of the time. But that it might be one of the other values in your data set. I have to say you have to link everything here, so there's no possibility to have unlinked records. But linked to the wrong entity with a probability gamma. Therefore, lambda plus n minus 1 times gamma is going to be 1, so that we deal with everything. And you can take this approach, this new random variable, and think, what am I going to do if I analyse that one? So if I analyse expected values with this new value y star, because everything's included, then that works out okay, no problems. As soon as I start calculating variances with y star under this exchangeable linkage error model, variances get inflated. So now if I'm going to go and analyse my linked data set with these linkage errors in, I'm going to make conservative inferences. I'm going to have too many type 2 errors. If I take correlations between this new variable, which has got linkage error in, and something else in my data set, those correlations get attenuated. And if I do regression with my new linked data set with this y star in it, then my regression parameter fits are biased. It's quite possible to extend that model, and Ray Chambers has done quite a lot of work, in fact several papers that work with this one. So you can think about the linkage being a type of permutation, so you're linking two sets of records by a permutation of the records. And if I have a matrix, which is just a permutation matrix A with ones in every one in every row and every column and zeros everywhere else, then I can permute my data set. And now I can define a matrix E, which is the expected value of that permutation matrix given some extra information. And I can write down the E matrix under the exchangeable linkage error model, the Nita model that I just talked about. But there are lots of other forms that are possible, and it's quite possible also to model this matrix E. And if E is known, or you can model it pretty well, then you can do bias-adjusted regression. If you want to make some extra assumptions about what happens to residuals in regression, then there's a maximum likelihood estimator. But neither of those sorts of approaches generally get used when you're analysing a linked data set. So I go back now to David's challenges 12 and 13. 12 says about quality of combined data sources, and 13 about do more with record linkage methods. And we think that that's not ambitious enough. There should be some more about how do I really analyse it, given that analyse these data, given that there are some linkage errors hiding inside. So we ought to analyse linked data accounting for linkage quality. At the very least, we ought to do some sensitivity analysis to see what it's like. If you look at Ray Chambers' work, you can see that the unbiased analysis quickly becomes very challenging, even in fairly simple situations. So these linked data administrative data sets might be really conceptually attractive, but need to be very careful about how you analyse them. And if we're thinking about developing a whole theory of administrative data, then we need to do a bit more testing at least, have some more examples about when these sorts of methods cause you to generate the wrong sorts of conclusions from a linked data set. That's me. Thank you.
I want to make 3 quick points to some of the responses, some of the points that David, Charles made. First is in relation to data quality, and make a point that administrative data are no different from any other sort of data, and that the safe starting point is to assume that the correct mindset is that all data are incomplete and potentially wrong until proven otherwise. The second point is that sometimes size does matter, and there administrative data trumps usually other forms of data. Third one is that in relation to data equals all, the strange thing about administrative data, as other people have said, is that sometimes more and more equals less and less. A few quick examples. Administrative data just relatively fresh off the press from ONS, NISRA in Northern Ireland. These are age standardised suicide rates for the 4 countries in the UK. Northern Ireland is thicker line and in green. And you can see it was minding its own business with the slowest rates of suicide from 1981 until about 2005 when something happened, and we have been, I was going to say enjoying, we've been experiencing the highest rates of suicide in the UK for the last 10 years. I've done research in around 2001 and in 2011, and I think that one of those bits of research is wrong. This change is not a real phenomenon in society. Something has happened to the data. And what had happened is that they changed the coroner system in Northern Ireland, and the rate changed correspondingly. I don't know which is the more correct system. I don't know whether the coroner system has changed in the other countries or should change, but it does put a question mark over the data. But we should know our data. But actually that makes us no different from any artist or artisan. We must know the materials and the tools we work with. As people have suggested, when you're set up your own study or survey, you are in control of the design and the curation, storage, and the data. With administrative data, you don't have that control. For design, we have process. And the curation and process are owned by the data custodian, and the researcher must engage with the data custodian to find out about that process. Actually, there's where administrative data adds something that ordinary surveys and studies don't, because by engaging with the data custodian, you're getting very close to the policymakers, and your ability therefore to change and influence things is more acute. Size matters. If you do really good studies and get published in really high-ranking journals, as these have, then that becomes the orthodoxy. So the orthodoxy is that in terms of caregiving, informal caring, that it is bad for your health. It will wreck your immune system. It will challenge your biology. It'll shorten your telomeres and shorten your life. That's the logical conclusion of all these papers. Actually, when you do the studies, linked administrative data studies, caregiving is associated with a 25 to 30% reduction in mortality rates. None of the other studies had the size or the power to do that. Administrative data was needed to do that. Census. This is 2001 census, Northern Ireland, 4.5%. Non-enumeration is anticipated or expected, estimated. When we link it to deaths over the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, we find that we're missing, unlinked, almost 20%, 1 in 5 of our suicides. Why? Because the 4.5% who are missing in the census are young, males, adults, deprived, inner city areas, people who are taking their lives. Just quickly, overlapping, not just about linkage, but the sorts of people in each of those data sets are different. Okay, so we wanted to look at migrants, and we said what sort of migrant types are in the census, in the NHS, and maybe in some of the other larger data sets. They will be different. More and more data sets gives you less and less people overlapping in the middle, and perhaps less representative. But the question I'll leave you with, does it matter? As somebody in Biobank would say, does it matter about representativeness? Anyway, thank you.
I really like the paper, but one thing that struck me was that there should be more emphasis on the data cleaning process and about documenting that, because when you have data, sometimes it's wrong, it's been accurately transcribed, but perhaps it's false, perhaps it's people who want mortgages, but they're lying about their income, and you need to try and understand the data. If you've got multiple data sources, maybe there are inconsistencies, maybe arbitrary choices have to be made about which set of data you need. And maybe the data's been processed by different methods, different groups, maybe in geographically different areas. So if you want to have reproducible science, you really need to have this pipeline documented as to what's being done. Because perhaps the final data set will get reused by another group, or perhaps the source data will get retrospectively updated like GDP data does. So I think there should be more emphasis on the data cleaning documentation. Thank you.